Violin playing used to feel really unnatural to me. And even though I was sure back then that violin playing had to feel more natural for players that were more talented, I actually had no idea how big the difference was. You see, I assumed to a certain extent that violin playing would always feel at least a bit unnatural, regardless of how good I got. But after I started studying the Dounis Method, it became clear to me that violin playing can actually feel completely natural, and this is what the great players feel when they play. But before we get into more, I'm David. I've been playing the violin for over 20 years, teaching for over 10, and posting tutorials online for the past 8 years. I've been studying the Dounis Method for over 10 years now, and this method has completely transformed my violin playing from unnatural to natural. If you watch a great player, you'll notice how effortless their playing looks, and that's because it feels effortless to them. And differences between the playing of a great player and an average one are so big that most players couldn't really comprehend it until they started transforming their own playing. This is what I experienced. I used to feel unnatural doing most of the movements on the violin. Doing vibrato, bowing, shifting, all felt like tasks that I had to learn how to do, and even if I got somewhat good at them, they never felt natural. And even the techniques that didn't really make me feel tense still didn't quite feel natural to do. Things like bow changes or string crossings, I didn't really have an understanding of how these should feel. And I noticed how in the great players, these very clearly looked and sounded differently. One day, I stumbled across a recording of David Nadian playing, and his playing looked more natural and effortless than almost anyone I'd seen before. I immediately became curious to find out who he had studied with and how he was able to get his playing to look and sound like that. I started studying his background and the teachers he'd studied with, and a lot of them seemed familiar, but one of the names stood out to me, Dunis. You see, I'd never actually heard of this teacher before, or his method, and I became curious to find out if his method was in fact responsible for teaching David Nadian to play the way that he did. Now, while David Nadian specifically was already a very natural player before he came to Dunis, he still did credit Dunis with being a great teacher, and with teaching him a lot of things about phrasing and musicality. But as I studied Dunis further, I found out that his method actually could transform someone's playing to look like David Nadian's. And the example was George Nykrug. George Nykrug was a self-described mediocre player, and even though he'd been playing the cello for a long time and had studied with some of the great players, he never found his playing to actually feel natural. That was until he started studying with Dunis. And when I watched and listened to George Nykrug's playing, I saw how natural and effortless it looked. And that was my goal. It became clear to me that this method could in fact transform my playing as well. As I started studying this method, it quickly became clear to me that this method was unlike anything else. You see, while some people may have heard of Dunis, the main thing that they know about him is his Dunis collection book, which has a lot of great exercises in them. But this is less than a fraction of what his method is about. His method is about transforming people's playing by bringing out their natural instincts, which is how the great players are able to play so effortlessly. But his method also heavily emphasizes musical expression, and in fact, it makes that the priority over technique. The goal of technique for the Dounis method is to allow you to play expressively, and when you have a natural technique, it's a lot easier to play expressively. Not only was this method effective at fixing some of the biggest problems I had, like a tense vibrato, inconsistent shifts, and a bad sound, but it taught me how to play expressively. Before the Dounis method, I was really confused about how to get your playing to sound more expressive. I sort of assumed that it was something that some players just did better and other players had to figure out for themselves. But this method laid out a clear approach on how to make your playing sound more expressive. And over the 10 plus years of studying this, I've seen my playing completely transform. Not only in how it sounds and looks, but in how it feels. You see, as I mentioned earlier, I never thought the violin playing could feel as natural as it does to me now. And the crazy thing is that for the really great players, it feels even more natural, and that's what I strive for. But as I've gone this far, I've understood so much about the struggle that average players face as they try to improve their playing. You see, even though a lot of teachers want to and try, they don't completely understand how to fix these problems that a lot of players have. When a student like me is of average talent, it's much harder to teach them things like how to play fast or how to get a good vibrato and sound if you can't explain every aspect to them. The thing about the Dounis method is you can actually explain pretty much every aspect there is to violin playing. And the level of detail in which I understand these techniques now is on a completely different level than when I first started. But the great thing about this method is that it also keeps things very simple to understand. So much so that I can explain the same exercise to a beginner and an advanced player in almost the same way, and they can both get a benefit from it. So, what are some examples of things that have actually improved my playing that wouldn't have improved if I studied any other method? Well, the vibrato is a big one. You see, before the Dounis method, I spent a lot of time studying other methods and their method of teaching vibrato, and it was never really clear to me. You see, the vibrato in particular is made up of two movements, a rubbing motion and a rotation motion with the finger. Both these happen at the same time. And I'll go more into that in another video. But the Dounis method taught me, in addition to those two things, that there's actually so many other aspects of the vibrato that almost no other method talks about. Things like releasing the initial impulse of the vibrato so it doesn't feel like you're constantly pumping the vibrato back and forth. Or things like how to connect your vibrato so that it sounds more legato. One of the other biggest changes I saw was in my bow hold. The bow hold always seemed like something that was taught somewhat dogmatically and sometimes very unclearly. Some teachers said that you should play with a Russian bow hold, others said Franco-Belgian, others said just to figure it out for yourself, essentially. But the Dounis method taught me how to hold the bow like it's a natural, everyday object. And once you have this hold, you start to look at the great players, and you see that the really great ones do this as well. You see, the thing that links all the great players together is that they use their natural instincts. In addition to, of course, playing very expressively, they have an intuitive understanding of how to use their natural instincts when they play. And that's why, regardless of where they studied or who they studied with, you'll see so many aspects to their playing that are similar amongst them. And these are the things that those great players struggle with teaching their students. Unless their students are also very naturally talented, it's hard for them to become aware of these things that are very intuitive to them. But Dunis was able to observe this and figure out the natural instincts that they were using to play. For example, with the bow hold. Dunis saw that the great players were able to have a balanced bow hold, but how they also shift their bow hold from the frog to the tip. At the frog, the weight of the hand is more so on the pinky, and at the tip, the weight of the hand transfers and pronates towards the index finger. This is something you'll see in a lot of the great players. And even though I started out without having a natural technique or an intuitive understanding of how to play, in a way that actually worked to my favor, because I had to learn how to do all these techniques and how to do them naturally. And in addition to that, I had to learn how to play expressively. This was something that was never intuitive to me, but this method taught me how to do it clearly. It taught me how to actually understand phrasing, musical impulses, and how to actually make my playing sound interesting for others to listen to. If you find yourself in a situation similar to me, and you want to learn more about this method, check out some of the resources below, including my free ebook.